Hi, this is Rabbi Jeremy Kreidel from Mahar, the Washington Congregation for Secular Humanistic Judaism here in Washington, D.C. And this is our fourth and final video regarding the Torah portions read during the traditional cycle in July. This week happens to start another Torah portion, Vayet Hanan is read fully on Shabbat, which is August 1st, so we will cover that one next month. But what we started last week in the Torah reading cycle is Parshat Devarim, the first Torah portion in the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy starts Ve'elet Devarim, and these are the words, and starts to narrate a speech, Moses' kind of valedictory speech, as he is standing on one side of the Jordan with the Israelites who are going to be able to pass over the Jordan River and into the land of Canaan when Moses can't go. So at the end of Deuteronomy, we read that Moses dies and is buried, and no one can find his grave. But we start with Moses giving this speech, and this is what Deuteronomy is really going to be, is a long oration by Moses. And when Moses starts the speech, Moses is going to start by retelling everything that's happened up to this point in terms of from the Exodus on to the Israelites being ready to cross into the land of Canaan as he's giving the speech, right? So he's going to re-narrate kind of everything. And most of what he's narrating, again, is all the narrative stuff that was in Exodus and in Numbers, less what's in Deuteronomy, because what he's narrating is what's important to the Deuteronomist. So we should stop and talk about the Deuteronomist for a second. The documentary hypothesis for the composition of the Torah says that there are four basic traditions, basic threads of tradition, running through the Torah: J, E, P, and D. J and E have a lot of narrative material. If you're reading Genesis, there's a lot of interplay between J and E as sources. And they represent different geographic kingdoms within the land of Israel during the first millennium BCE. So J is associated with the Yahwistic tradition. J is pronounced as a Y in German, which is where we get these letters from. J is associated with the Yahwistic tradition and with Judah, the southern kingdom. E is connected with the use of the term Elohim for God, and is connected to the kingdom of Israel, which is the northern chunk of the land of Israel. So there are these two traditions, J and E, and there's P. P is regarded as a priestly source. And you can identify these strands of traditions within the text of the Torah because they have specific concerns and they have specific kinds of vocabulary that they use. So the P source is very well known for being the source from which the first chapter of Genesis comes from, because it's very concerned about categorizing things, which is a very priestly oriented kind of thing to do. You need to worry about categories when you're a priest, for impurity purposes and all kinds of other things. And you're worried about genealogies and not so much sort of broader narrative strokes, right? And so these are the three sources that really make up Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Deuteronomy is mostly its own source on the documentary hypothesis, a source called D. And D stands for Deuteronomist, for Deuteronomy. The word Deuteronomy itself just means second law. It's called Deuteronomy in German as well, Deuteronomium, actually. And so the D source is going to be almost everything in the book of Deuteronomy. Subsequent scholarly research suggests that maybe there's two or three threads of tradition in the D source, so we shouldn't get carried away and think J, E, P, and D are just documents that got pasted together. It doesn't seem to be the case. But Deuteronomy is going to almost entirely be from the D source, and the D source has a particular spin. And the traditions behind the D source, the Deuteronomist, filter into lots of other biblical books. So the next books in the narrative in the former prophets. So after Deuteronomy in the typical Bible, whether you're using a Christian Bible or a Jewish one, you get Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, all of which are strongly tied to the Deuteronomistic tradition. The entire Deuteronomistic tradition has a particular way that it looks at the world, and the way is this. If you follow God's commandments, you will prosper, and if you don't, you will suffer. And it doesn't necessarily understand this on an individual level so much as on a national level. So when the Israelites follow the rules that are laid out in the Torah, they prosper, and when they don't, they suffer. And that's the frame for almost everything in D. And we get the frame right up front in the book of Deuteronomy. So the book of Deuteronomy does not linger around and talk about things like what happened to Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu. That's part of the Leviticus narrative. It's focused on the journey, and it's focused on, we didn't get to cross into the land of Israel because you people, you Israelites, weren't following the rules. This is Moses' opening kind of statement, writ large. We had to go here because you didn't follow the rules. We had to go there. We had to go to this place. We had to go to that place. You didn't want to cross over into the land of Israel when we got there the first time. We could have been done with this a long time ago, but you were faithless. And so you had to wander more, and you had to wander more. And bad things kept happening to you because you kept complaining. That's kind of the opening chunk that we find represented in the book of Deuteronomy. There's also some discussion of the appointment of judges. That's something that comes from Exodus. There's some discussion of some laws. Again, a lot of them are from Exodus. But the opening to Deuteronomy is, here's the story up until now. And the story up until now is, you people are badly behaved, and you were badly behaved over and over and over and over again. And this made God mad, and God didn't let us cross into the land of Israel, and your entire generation, except for Caleb and my helper Joshua, get to go into the land. Your children will go into the land. You can't go. I can't go. So this is Moses saying, also, I can't go. Moses can't go on this retelling, not because of something he has done, but instead, and I'm using the Everett Fox translation of the Torah here, and Fox translates this, "Pray, let me cross over that I may see the good land that is in the country across the Jordan, this good hill country and the Lebanon. But Yahweh was cross with me on your account, and he would not hearken to me. Yahweh said to me, enough for you. Do not speak to me any more about this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah, and lift up your eyes toward the sea, toward the north, toward the south, and towards sunrise. See it with your eyes, for you will not cross this Jordan." So Moses is making a very straightforward statement. The reason I couldn't cross is because you people prevented it. Setting aside that this is a little bit passive-aggressive, this is also not the narrative that we got in Numbers. The narrative we got in Numbers is a little bit different. What did Numbers say? Numbers told us that Moses and Aaron, after Miriam's death, were asked for water. There was no water. They plead with God, and God says, Moses, go out and speak to the rock, and water will issue forth. Moses walks out, and rather than speak to this rock, he hits it twice with a stick, and God says, that's enough for you. You're not going to the promised land either. Deuteronomy changes this to say, it's your fault, Israelites. This is not about Moses' agency anymore. More Moses as passive victim. So it's a change in the narrative, and we need to be aware that the change in the narrative happens because it fits with Deuteronomy's narrative, Deuteronomy's view of the world, and the Deuteronomistic view of the world is very straightforwardly, when the people follow the Torah, they prosper, and when they don't, they suffer. And so it rereads Moses' inability to enter the land of Israel to be something that is the fault of the Israelites and not the fault of Moses himself necessarily. The fault with Moses in this narrative was, as we saw in Deuteronomy, that he kept asking, I want to cross over. No. I want to cross over. No. Stop talking to me about it. That's the narrative that Deuteronomy presents, and not, there was no water, I struck a rock, that was a problem. So we need to be aware that as we move through the texts of the Torah, the stories change. The same story will change sometimes and reflects the needs and the perspectives of the writers who are preserving that version of the story, which is really what we're seeing here with this change in the Deuteronomistic narrative. Right? The change in the narrative is Deuteronomy's worldview is going to be coming across in the book of Deuteronomy, and that has to come through in how the voyage through the desert is understood and how Moses' inability to cross over into the land of Canaan with the Israelites is understood. Because now, Torah here, Deuteronomy here, is trying to make a point. Follow these rules so that bad things don't happen to you. Important to know here is that most modern scholarship suggests that an awful lot of what's in Deuteronomy came just before the Babylonian exile, around the year 612. The Babylonian exile is in 587, so you can see there were only a few decades separated, or after the Babylonian exile, possibly in exile in Babylonia, also possibly some of it after Israelites had come into Judah, into what became the land of Judea, into Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. And the narrative that Deuteronomy is portraying is how Israelite and then Jewish theological views approached the problem of being forced into exile. And the answer to why were we forced into exile was we didn't follow the Torah. That was also the answer to why was the kingdom of Israel destroyed in 720. The answer, well, they didn't follow the Torah. So they were destroyed and they were dispersed. We didn't follow the Torah. We were sent into exile in 587. So that Deuteronomy is not actually trying to make an argument in advance to say, we're doing bad things and bad things are going to happen to us and we're going to be sent into exile. That the point of Deuteronomy is we've seen this happen already. How do we prevent it again? Now that we're back in the land, now that we have a chance of being back in the land, how do we prevent it again? And the answer is follow the Torah. If you follow the Torah, you will be able to stay in the land. So that's the modern scholarly approach to this, and it comes forth right away in Parshat Devarim at the beginning of Deuteronomy. A lot of the rest of Deuteronomy is a repetition of laws that we will already have seen at other Torah portions at other points in the Torah. Deuteronomy itself means second law, or a repetition of the law, and so there will be slight variations in the Ten Commandments, and there are slight variations in the laws that are recounted, the holidays, and things like that. So we need to be, as we work through Deuteronomy, we should be aware that the laws that have been looked at before are going to change. And they often won't change in huge substance, but they'll change enough that if you're reading closely, you'll notice. The most famous of these is in Exodus. It says, keep the Sabbath. And in Deuteronomy, it says, remember the Sabbath in the Ten Commandments. It's so famous that it's part of a liturgical poem, Lecha Dodi, which has a line, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, keep and remember, as a single statement, a single command. This isn't the only repetition of laws, and it's not the only variation we will see. And there are laws that appear in Deuteronomy that appear nowhere else in the Torah, very specifically laws about governing the Israelite polity. Can you have a king? If you're going to have a king, what is the king supposed to do? What's the role of the priest? These are things that aren't addressed in Exodus, in Leviticus, and in Numbers, but they are in Deuteronomy, which reflects, again, the scholarly consensus is this facet of how Deuteronomy talks, this facet of what Deuteronomy talks about, reflects post-exilic life when Israelites have had kings and have seen the bad things that come from having a king, as opposed to what the Torah maybe suggests is the more traditional, more appropriate version of Israelite society and governance, which is a confederation of tribes. If you read the book of Judges, you'll see that this is not even a confederation necessarily. They fight with each other a lot. They go to war against each other. So it's more difficult than maybe the biblical assumption would give you reason to believe. Nevertheless, that's for when we get to talking about what Israelite polity ought to look like later in Deuteronomy. So those are really the high points for the book of Deuteronomy's first parashah, right? Parshat Devarim. And in subsequent weeks, we'll look at subsequent Torah portions from Deuteronomy to see how things change, what's different, what's similar, and what's new.